the studio. We're upstairs today, which is where we're going to start. I pulled this log cabin quilt off of the frame yesterday. I used a digital pantograph called Meandering Jasmine, and we got it quilted. This is an older quilt top that I was inherited from one of my mentors. It did not have a border on it, and if I had had better foresight, I would have added a border. I probably would have just used some of this backing fabric that I had purchased. This was 108-inch wide fabric, so I would have had plenty to do the border, but I didn't, so it's too late. But I am going to use the same fabric that's left over from the backing as my binding, and that's what we're going to be showing today, just a basic bias binding for a quilt. First thing I'm going to do is trim up the edge of this with my rotary cutter and ruler. And I don't have a lot of options for making this perfectly square because I don't have much to cut off since there's no border. The outside log of the log cabin is the same as all the other logs, and I don't want to cut too much off of it even though it's the edge of the quilt. So I'm just going to pretty much straighten it up, floating the ruler along the edge of the quilt just to get it as straight as possible without aiming for perfection. Rotary cutting is always a three-part system. You have a rotary ruler, a rotary cutter, and a rotary mat, a self-healing mat. And the mat protects the blade, the ruler protects the quilt and your hands. And so I'm just going to roughly line up the ruler with the edge of the quilt, and I'm going to have to shift my ruler a little bit as I go because I don't want to shave off too much of the outer log of the log cabin. So I won't trim this as accurately as I might have done for a quilt. I'm really just aiming for getting it roughly straightened up because this is going to be a utility quilt, not an art quilt. And I don't think anyone would notice a little bit of wave. Also, we're going to have the binding on there, which will cover up some of the mistakes. As I'm shifting the quilt, I want to make sure that I don't get any of it tucked underneath itself and actually cut off something that I need. I'm flattening it out, making sure it's nice and flat. And I'll start again. Every time I put my ruler down, I try and make sure that I close it, especially with a blade like this. This blade was designed to cut up to 6 to 12 layers of fabric. Because so much of the blade is exposed, if this were to fall off of the table with the blade open, this could cut through the top of my shoe. They are surgical steel rotary cutting blades, so you really do have to be careful. You can see I'm trimming off a little bit of the quilt, but I'm trying to trim off as little as possible while still trying to maintain a square edge. Sometimes that means just aiming from one block to the other until I get all the way across the edge. Normally I would use a large square, maybe a 16-inch square ruler, to make sure that the corners were square and then trim in between the two corners. But again, I don't have that luxury since the quilt has no border, and that last piece of the block is just a thin, it's probably 1.5 inches. So visually I wouldn't want to cut too much off of that. this fast and furious trimming would not be what I would recommend with any kind of show quilt or special gift. So now I have the 4 edges trimmed. There's not much of this piece I can save, but I will go ahead and save any of the pieces of fabric I can. Even if I don't use those, somebody in my guild might use those for charity quilts. It's time for me to figure out the amount of binding that I need, amount of fabric I need to make the binding. We know that a quilt has 4 sides, and I've measured this quilt. This particular quilt is 55 by 73. Since we have 2 edges that are 55 and 2 edges that are 73, we need to add up all 4 of those pieces. So it's going to be 55 plus 55 plus 73 plus 73. And that's going to give us a total of 256 linear inches of binding that we need. That calculation gives us all 4 edges of our quilt. Now we need to decide what thickness we're going to cut the binding. I'm going to use bias binding, and I'm going to cut it at 2.5 inches. So I'm going to take my 256 and multiply that times 2.5, which is how wide the binding is going to be. 256 times the 2.5 inch width binding that I'm going to use comes out to 640 inches. The next thing I need to know is how wide is the fabric that I'm actually going to use to make the binding. And traditionally that would be somewhere between 40 and 44 inches, because that's the width of fabric off of the bolt. But I'm using the leftover backing fabric, and my strip isn't 40 inches wide. So I'm going to trim that edges up on that leftover piece of fabric and then calculate how wide it is before I can figure out my next measurement. This piece of fabric was left over after I cut the wide backing down to fit the size of fabric I needed for the backing of the quilt. And the fabric's been washed, and it's got some fraying along the edges. Because this is a digital print and the dye doesn't soak all the way through, you can see on the edge here where some of the dye has not got through to the cotton, and I'm going to trim all that off. I'm also going to trim it off because I'm going to be sewing these edge to edge, and I want nice clean edges for me to sew. It just makes it a little easier for me to visualize that as I'm sewing. So first I'm just going to trim off both edges, and I have extra fabric here so I don't have to be too accurate with my cutting. And now I'm just going to clean up all the other 3 edges of this fabric. And in fact I think I'm going to fold it in half after I cut off this edge so that I get nice perpendicular edges. Probably still too wide for the ruler, so I'm going to fold it one more time. Now I can easily cut both sides of this without having to fuss too much with the ruler. I'm getting one of my fold lines on one of the lines on the table, and then I'm just going to use the opposing line to clean up my fabric. Still not happy with that. I'm going to trim a little bit more. I know that I've got more than enough fabric here to do the binding. so I don't have to worry about scrimping too much on saving the very edges of this fabric. So now I have one really long piece of fabric that's going to be more than long enough for what I need, and I just need to know how wide it is. It's a little bit more than 20 inches, but I'm just going to say 20. Now we can get back to our calculation. I know I need a total of 640 inches of fabric. I'm going to be dividing it by the 20 inches of the width of this fabric. This is actually 20.5, but I'm rounding down a little bit. So my 640 divided by 20, and that gives me 32. The 32 represents how many inches of fabric I need of this piece. So if I open this up, and I measure out 32 inches, that would be how much of this fabric I need to make the binding for all four sides of the quilt that I just finished, the log cabin quilt. So I'm going to go ahead and cut off. I'm actually probably going to add a few inches just to incorporate the joining of the edges and the fold at the corner. So instead of 32, I might do 36 inches. This piece of fabric is all I need to make the binding 2.5 inches wide for the log cabin quilt. The piece is 36 inches long and 20 inches high, and I'm going to cut on the bias my 2.5 inch strips. Now I could just go ahead and start on a 45-degree angle cutting 2.5 inch strips, but I always like to do one cut first, and I'm going to cut this corner wedge off at a 45-degree angle and then attach it to that end. And gee, what is that, a parallelogram? I'm not sure. Rhombo, I don't know. I don't know the name of it, but I'll show you when I get it done. So I'm going to go ahead and make sure that I have this on the straight line of the mat, because I'm going to use the mat to help me line up. I'm going to use the 45-degree line mark on my ruler. And my ruler 45-degree line is actually lining up on the mat, not on the fabric, just to make it easier for me from the side I'm on. But I'm going to go ahead and cut. I almost did it wrong. That was a 60-degree. So I have my 45-degree line. I'm going in right at the very point of this corner, and I'm going to cut as far as the ruler allows. And now I'm going to line up the rest of the way with this straight line that I've already cut. Now I'm going to take this piece and attach it on this side. I'll just put my right sides together, and I'll sew down that line, and when I get finished, all of my pieces will be the same length. I won't have any smaller pieces of binding to cut, but I'll show you that as soon as I get it sewn on and ironed open. Okay, I took my two pieces and I laid them right sides together and I sewed them, and in the case of bias binding, I always iron the seams open so that the bulk is spread out. So I have sewn this and ironed the seam open, and we have this shape. And whatever this shape is, Rusty would know right off the top of her head, this is the shape I want to cut my strips. I'm going to be laying the ruler on here at the 2.5 inch mark. My edge is going to be lining up with this cut edge, and we're going to be cutting strips all the way across, and you can see when I get to this edge that I have the same angle. So the strips would all be these 20-inch strips. Well, they'll actually be longer than that because I'm cutting at an angle. But they're all going to be the same height. So I don't have to keep this on the straight line anymore. I can go ahead and lay this in a way that makes it easier for me to lay the ruler down. And this particular ruler has a 1/2 inch addition at the end, so I just have to come over to it's a 1/2 inch at 1 and 2. Now I could have cut this at 2 1/4, 2 3/8, and those measurements would have been 2.25 or 2.375 when I was doing my math, but I used the 2 1/2. I'm just making sure my line is right there on the edge. And this is my first strip. I'm just going to continue cutting all of these strips out, and then we'll take these to the sewing machine and sew them together edge to edge. One thing I can say also, if you have a really wide piece of fabric, you can fold this up on top of itself as long as the straight edge is perfectly on top of itself. You will have to reposition this as you go, because the more strips you cut, the less folded it will become. But this is just another way to get it all done under one ruler swipe, so I can show you what that would look like. I've got my line right on the edge of that I've already cut. And I have another strip ready to go. But as you can see, I'm already down a couple inches. As I keep cutting across, that's going to give you less and less of a fold, and at some point you will have to refold the fabric. But whenever you can have your fabric underneath the ruler, and the ruler's holding the fabric in place, you have less possibility for the fabric to shift as you're getting ready to cut. Now you can see it's almost all the way to the bottom now. Maybe I'll get 1 or 2 more done, and then I would have to fold the fabric back up again. I think at this point I would just go ahead and refold. Binding is not my favorite part of quilting, but it's not the making of the binding that I don't like. And sometimes I'll actually make the binding before I even get completely finished with the top, so that once it's ready, all I have to do is put it on. And I don't even mind the machine part of adding the binding on to the quilt, except the very end where you have to join the seam. That's not an area that I'm really good at. Now I don't know if this strip is going to be wide enough to do the whole strip. I'm just going to lay it on here and see. Right about here, it's no longer 2.5 inches. This piece is too thin up here. So I'm just going to mark that and then cut that at an angle. Actually, I think I'm just going to mark it from here with my 45-degree line. Actually going to go down one and cut this off. I'm going to get rid of that. So now at least I've salvaged that much of that piece. So all I have to do is take these to the sewing machine and get them sewn together end to end, and we get to ironing all the seams open and folding it in half. This is in effect how these pieces are going to be sewn together. We want them to be joined this way, and it's kind of a funny angle. It's not something that we do a lot in quilting. In order for that to happen, we have to sew this seam this way. And you have these little ears sticking out, and that may be something that you're not used to doing or seeing. So you might want to measure the first couple of them just so that you get the idea of what they should look like. And the way that I measured this, I just laid the ruler over each piece, and 1/4 of an inch from this way I made a line. 1/4 of an inch from this way I made a line on this edge, and then I laid the ruler on the bias edge at 1/4 of an inch, and I made a line there also, making little hash marks on the quilt where my point should be, where if I'm going to pin. I did the same thing on this piece, so you can see both sides have hash marks. So if I line this back up the way it was, and I flip this edge over, I know that basically this is how that's going to stitch out. I'm going to take my pen and put it right through the first hash mark, right at the crosshair, and I'm going to do the same thing on this piece, looking at the back, getting my pen right through the hash mark. And I'm not going to pin it, stabilize it yet. The pen's just piercing both crosshairs because I still want this edge to be able to move. So I'm doing the same thing on this side. The pen is piercing right through both crosshairs. I can lightly smooth out the edges so that I have both of the bias edges are completely laying flat on top of each other. And now I can go ahead and use my pen to pin those in place. And what you have is something that looks like this. The pen is piercing both the crosshairs on the front and the back. You can see I have dog ears on both sides, and this is just a visual for you to train your eye to know what to look for. Now you could absolutely, if you wanted perfect binding, measure every single one of those and pin those 2 spots. And with a quilt this size it wouldn't take very long. There's only about 10 or 12 of those pieces. But what we're going to do, this valley that's created by the edge of the bias strip and the dog ear is exactly where the needle's going to go in at. And the valley at the opposite end is where the needle's going to come out of. And by doing that we should get perfect edges, perfect seams, and perfect placement on our bias strip. Sometimes if you don't do it, the pieces will be like a drunken path. They'll be walking and then they jut to the right or to the left 1/8 of an inch, 1/16 of an inch. It depends on what kind of day you're having. But I'm going to go ahead and do this first seam and then we'll see what it looks like. Okay, again, the straight edge, the dog ear creates a valley. That's where my needle's going to go in. I'm lining up my 2 seam lines with my 1/4 edge marking, and I'm going to come out the valley in between the bias edge and the dog ear. I'm going to remove my pen. And because a lot of this fabric is on the bias, as the name implies, bias binding, we want to be careful not to overhandle the fabric because we don't want it to stretch. But you can see after I get this ironed open, I'd have to iron my seam open, but that will give us a nice flat continuous piece. So I'm just going to continue adding these together end by end until we get all of our pieces together in one unit. I'm going to go over this one more time just in case it wasn't clear. These are the last two strips that I have to connect. All the rest of them are pinned and ready to go. On this piece here, and oddly enough this is the one that looks like it's the bias edge, but this shorter edge is actually on the straight grain. These two edges are bias. But I'm going to lay the 1/4 inch mark right on the edge of my small side, and I'm just going to make little hash marks close to the end, and then I'm going to lay the ruler on the bias edge, the long edge, at the 1/4 inch mark and make another line. What I'm creating is a little X or a little crosshair right in the area that needs to be pinned. That's one side. Now I'm going to do the other the same exact way. I have my ruler on the short edge making 2 marks. I have it on the bias edge making my little X or my crosshairs. And here I have 2 points that I could use to pin. This is the way that they will join together. It has to flip like this in order for us to do that. And I'm going to use pins to go through the crosshair at the top piece and the crosshair at the bottom piece. And I'm just going to leave that loose until I can get the other one pinned in the same manner. And I will tell you one mistake that I make over and over and over when I'm using bias or batik fabric for making my binding, and that's I join the wrong sides together, and it will be going along and the seam will be on the top and going along, and then the seam's on the bottom, and I have to take it apart. If you were to take the time to do these crosshairs on all of your fabric, then you wouldn't make the mistake of sewing the wrong sides together. But with a printed fabric like this, you don't have to worry about that because you know that the right sides have to face each other. It's just on batik, there really isn't visually a wrong and right side. So now I have all of my pieces pinned together, and I've done all the rest of them. I just have to sew them together. And I haven't even taken my previous piece out because I can chain piece these as I'm going through. Doesn't matter which side is up, but I can go ahead and line up the next piece. My starting point is I have the bias edge here and the dog ear. That little valley right here is where I want to start the needle. And then I can go ahead and remove the pin, and this piece is shifted a little bit, so I'm going to get it back in line. And when I come out, I should be coming out right between the long edge and the dog ear again. So I have those 2 little V marks that I'm aiming for at the top and bottom, and now I can just keep going from one to the other until I get all of them sewn. Also, I want to say I always get comments on the decals that I have on both my Bernina 435 and my Bernina Q24, and these come from Urban Elements. They're called Tattoo Elements, and they do have a catalog that has quite an assortment of the different decals on there. There's both some masculine and feminine designs, a lot of flowers, some retro mid-century, and we have some flames. And these also can be seen on the website. So I'm going to keep sewing these, and then I'll get to the point where we're going to take this off and iron all of our little seams open, and then we'll get it rolled up. Once you pull your strips out of the machine, it looks a little bit like that because we chain piece this, and all we have to do is just cut the little links in between the chain piecing, and we free up all of our pieces. Now what you have is a piece of bias fabric that's now long enough to go around all four sides. That includes a little bit for the corners and also for joining the seam on the end. And one of the things I like to do, next step for me, will be making sure that all of my little seams from joining those pieces are ironed open. And the reason we do that is so that we have the bulk from the fabric on each side rather than in one side, which might cause a little bit of a problem in getting the binding to lay flat. And as I do this, I'm going to see some pieces that already have been ironed open, and that was from my original piecing when I made that rhomboid or parallelogram or whatever it was, whatever that shape is. So you can see some are done and already. You can see also the little dog ears still left on there. Sometimes I trim those off, sometimes I don't. It all depends on how neat I'm being. Ultimately, once it gets attached to the quilt, those are going to get buried inside the hand sewing anyway. So you could cut them off to reduce the bulk, but if you didn't, I don't think it's going to make a noticeable difference anywhere. So I'm going to go ahead and continue with this, and then I'll show you the next step. We're almost to the end of my binding prep. I have all of my little seams opened up. The next step I'm going to do is fold over these two bias edges. And again, that's the funny part. This is bias, this is bias. This little portion is straight of grain. So I'm going to carefully fold that up on top of itself so that the two edges are perfectly in a line. And I really want to take my time with this because it's easy to get ahead of yourself and get sloppy with this. And why I want to take my time is because if the two edges aren't perfectly aligned, when you attach this to the quilt, you may not attach both edges, and then your binding will fail. So I really want to take my time, and the reason I know that is from experience, because I have a habit of getting sloppy with different steps. So I've learned that I really need to slow down at this step. I just have to use one of my Zen moments, put on some nice music if I have to, have relaxing thoughts. I'm not thinking about the time, I'm simply focused on these two edges. And depending on which way I shift the iron, I can kind of get that top layer to shift a little bit with it. After I get this edge folded, the next thing I like to do, which is completely unnecessary, but it's one of the areas where my OCD kicks in, and that is to roll up the binding into a nice little sphere. So I'm going to go ahead and continue, and we'll bring you back when I roll. I have all my strips sewn end to end. I've ironed the seams open on all the strips. Then I've folded the bias so that the two raw edges are touching each other. And now I'm going to do my final phase, which is just rolling up my binding into a little coil. And I usually do that around a pencil. The pencil just gives me something to start with, and then I can lightly roll it up even if I take the pencil out. And I'm just going to roll this into a coil. Sometimes I'll even use the width of the pencil space to put my no lift bar on my Bernina through there, and that gives it some place to hold on to while I am attaching the binding, so it doesn't get caught up under the wheels of my chair or under my feet. But I'm just going to continue rolling this up, making sure that I keep my two raw edges nice and neat. And this is always therapeutic for me, because I know when I get to this point that I'm almost finished with the binding process. Even if I make this ahead of time, the reason I coil it is I can pop this into a Ziploc sandwich bag or a snack bag, depending on how big it is, and I can keep this with the project until I'm ready to use it. As I said, sometimes I will go ahead and make my binding as I'm starting the quilt, because I know approximately what size it's going to finish. Even if I want to add a little bit of buffer space on there, I can make it a little bit bigger. Sometimes I do handwork, sometimes I do machine work, and I like to do the machine work in the day, and if I've got free time in the day, that's when I'll get my binding done. But I love these little coils of binding. And I actually have a box or a bin that has all my leftover binding pieces in it, or binding that I've made and decided to switch out. And it comes in handy sometimes if you need to finish something. I've gotten lucky quite a few times, and a binding I made for one project works perfectly for another. So you can see how that's coming out. It just is a very nice even way to keep this together. And once I get to the end, I can just stick a pin in it and keep it organized until I'm ready to use it. But today we're going to pop it on a quilt as soon as I get it rolled up. And that is what my finished binding looks like. This is just a beautiful picture of joy. If I were going to store my little coil of binding, I might pop it into one of these bags, and I save these bags when I do the applique projects. They come in handy. The process for attaching this to the quilt, and this is the quilt that this binding was made for, is to line up the raw edge, the two raw edges actually, because it's folded, with the raw edge of the quilt that I've just trimmed. And I want to make sure that I leave a really good tail to start with, because once I get around the full perimeter and back to this, I need to join these two seams much the same way we did for the original binding section. And you know, you have to flip those at that funny angle. So I would leave myself a good bit of space, maybe 12 inches or so, here at the beginning where I'm going to start. And I always start in the middle side of a quilt. I never start on an end. And then I would start sewing, and then when I get around to the side again, I will again leave a tail so that I have plenty of room to attach those two ends together. And once I have them attached and ironed, then I can go ahead and lay them down and finish off that last seam. So I'm going to show you how I get that done. Okay, I have my quilt here set up on the table. I've set up a little side table here just to hold some of the weight of it so it doesn't get drug off. You can see I'm leaving about 12 inches before where I start, and I am putting this onto the top so that when it's finished I can flip this over, and then it will get either hand whipped to the back or it would get machine sewn down the back. I don't like to do the machine on both pieces. I like to put it on by machine, roll it to the back, and then hand whip it, but everybody has their own style. I have switched my foot to my walking foot because this is not a dual feed machine, and the walking foot just makes it a little bit easier to get all of these layers through evenly. There is a notch on the front of the foot that gives me my 1/4 inch mark, and that's about what I want to shoot for. And I'm just going to carefully and patiently sew this on until we get to the corner. If I had quilt gloves on, that might help me keep a grip of the fabric a little bit better, but I haven't used quilt gloves in at least 15 years. Probably if I found them and put them on, they would fall apart. You can see already we've got this machined on, and then if you flip this around, that would give you a nice binding. And I think the fabric, I really got lucky with that backing fabric, and also it's my binding fabric, that it matches so well. So I'm just going to keep going until I get to the corner. And I'm almost to the corner, and I like to use this little measuring gauge. This has all kinds of size on it: a 1/4 inch, 1/8 inch, 3/8 inch, 5/8, a 1/2 inch, 1 1/2, 2 inches. But what I'm going to use it for is the 1/4 inch. And I'm going to put the 1/4 inch right down to the very corner of the fabric, and I'm going to use a pin and have that pin sticking out, so I'll be able to see it when we get to it, even with the binding on top of it. I'm about 3 inches from the corner. I can see my pin sticking out here, which is basically a 1/4 inch from the edge. And when that pin gets to the same position that the needle is, I'm going to stop and put my needle down. Oh, I can't even see where to do that. There it is. I put my needle down. I'm going to lightly lift up the foot and pivot the quilt so that I'm going to sew off at a 45-degree angle right to the corner of the quilt. And that's only going to be a couple stitches. I'll take the quilt out, and you can see I've sewn straight along, and then when I got a 1/4 inch away, I went at a 45-degree angle right to the corner. Now I'm going to reposition the quilt. I'm just folding this up so that my new fold line gets as close to being even with that edge as possible. And when I get this a nice square fold there, I'm going to go ahead and put that underneath the machine. And I'm just going to start right at the edge of the quilt and sew right on and continue on until I get to the next corner. I'm going to repeat the process again so that you can clearly see what I did. I have my gauge, and I'm going to use the 1/4 inch measure here. I'm measuring from this corner up. I'm going to lay the gauge right down here to the edge, and I'm going to stick a pin right here in the fabric, even with the gauge. So this pin is now 1/4 of an inch away from this edge. I'm going to go ahead and just lay my binding on top of that. I'm going to continue sewing with this edge on top of the corner. When this pin gets to the same position as the needle, then I'm going to stop and pivot towards the corner. I've dropped my needle. I'm 1/4 of an inch away from the edge. I'm going to pivot the quilt so that I'm going to be sewing now towards the very corner peak and sew off of the quilt. It's funny that my bobbin ran out just as I got to the edge. I'm glad I got all the way down there. As you can see, my seam line goes down to the 1/4 inch mark and then it angles off towards the very corner of the quilt. Then I will fold this fabric over so that it creates a nice square with my little fold on the bias there. And I'll just get that lined up and put that under the foot. And I want the needle to start off of the fabric and then when we get that open, this will create a nice bias fold on the other side as well. So I'll just continue doing that until I get all 4 corners on and I get up to the other edge, and then I'll show you how I connect the 2 sides. This is where we started, the edge that we started on, and we left this tail open. We have all of this flexibility on the edge, and this is where I finished. I just came around the last corner, and you can see how good the measurement is. This is how much bias binding I have left after going all the way around. So I'm probably going to have about 20 inches left over. So what I want to do is I'm going to take this piece and open it up, but I want to try and keep it as flat as possible. And I think I'm going to put a couple pins in there. I must have knocked one of my pin cushions on the floor because I can't find it. So I want to keep this nice and tight so that I get accurate measurement. Then I'm going to take this piece and lay it over top. And you can see right here where this edge is, I'm going to make a mark, and I'm going to put a ruler over it to make sure that I get a nice clear rendering of where that line is. Now I can take this piece away because I know I'm got that the size I need it. And here you can see my seam line. Now normally when you join 2 pieces of fabric together that have to be a specific size, like the 2 ends of this binding, you would need to add 1/4 of an inch on each side. But because this seam line doesn't have to end up in a very specific place, it just has to have enough seam allowance, I'm actually going to add 1/2 inch, the 1/4 inch from each piece, but I'm going to add it to this one. So I'm going to put my ruler on the 1/2 inch mark. I've added to the length, and I'm going to make a good line there. Now I can go ahead and take this off, and I'm going to use my rotary cutter now and the 45-degree line on my ruler to make sure that I'm cutting this at the right angle. And this is always fun because you're working with weird angles and already folded, already sewn. So you have a lot of things going on there. But I'm going to go ahead and cut this. I'm lining at my 45 degree on the edge. I've got my 1/2 inch seam allowance, so I'm going to go ahead and cut this strip as soon as I find out where I laid my rotary cutter. Okay, I found my rotary cutter. I have the 45 degree lined up. I have the 1/2 inch added on to one side of my bias strip, and I'm going to cut this off. This is what remains of my finished bias binding. I can go ahead and coil that up and put it in my scrap box. And now what I have to do is join these two pieces together. And you can see how that's going to join together like that. But in order to do that, we're going to have to fold the quilt up in a funny way. I have to create a lot of gap in between that. And then we have to, let's see. And I'll tell you, I will freely admit this is not my favorite part. We want that, so we have to fold it like this. And you could have marked like we did in a previous section for this, but I didn't mark. But I'm going to go ahead and make sure I have my dog ears. I'm going to use 3 pins to make sure that I have the edges lined up. And now if you can see if I can get these to lay flat, we have our 2 valleys. We're going to sew along this line and try and get that as accurate as possible. Okay, I've folded up the quilt so I could get this weird seam underneath the foot. I did switch back to my 1/4 inch foot because I only have a little bit left to do on the binding. But you could just finger press this, or you could try and get this little bit under your iron so that the seam allowance gets pushed a little bit to each side. Basically trying to finger press that seam open the way we did with the iron on the rest of the pieces. But then when you pull the quilt taut, it will close back up your 2 raw edges, and you can go ahead and put that back under the machine where you stopped, having a little bit of tension to make sure that this gets quilted evenly to the edge, sewn evenly to the edge without any puckering. And if you've done a pretty good job of measuring, pinning, cutting, and sewing, there shouldn't be any. This was my start point here, and this was my finish point, and this is the part where we joined, and this is all that's left of my coil of binding, so I'll put that in my scrap box. And you can see we have a nice mitered edge all the way around on all of the pieces. And to finish this, the person who's going to do it, and it won't be me, is going to flip this edge over and then hand whip down this side. And a lot of people like to use the little clips to hold this in place as they stitch, but this would be the finishing. In full disclosure, I don't do my hand binding anymore because I have a friend that does it for me. We swap. I do quilting and she does binding. So this would be how that finishes off. And if you see this again, and you might, this will all be finished. This will be a utility quilt. Won't be an art quilt, so I will go ahead and use regular binding on it, which is what I did. So this is my binding attached to all 4 sides. I have my mitered corners. I have the joins together on a miter as well, and then these would get flipped around to the back and hand sewn. Some people would flip these around and then top stitch on that folded edge rather than hand stitching. It's just not a finish that I like to look at, but I know that some people do it really well. I'm not very good at it, so it doesn't end up being pretty. So either I would do it by hand or I would have somebody else do it by hand for me. Why did we choose this type of binding? There are other types of binding. Some people will just cut strips of fabric either on the cross grain or on the straight of grain and attach those to the quilt. And I will tell you why I don't do that. When you buy fabric, it comes off of the bolt, and these are the two selvage edges here. So this across here is called the cross grain, and that has some stretch to it. As you're going down the bolt, this is the length of grain, it's also the selvage edge. It has almost no stretch. And then when you cut on the 45 degree, this is a bias, and you can see how much stretch that has. And this plays into why we use fabric that's cut on the bias. Whenever you're handling a quilt, whether it's on the bed or you're folding it up or you're putting it away, what we grab it by is the edge. The edge is the most handled portion of a quilt, and when you're pulling it up at night on the bed or it's tucked under something and you're yanking it, what you're doing is pulling on this edge of the quilt. If you use cross grain strips, it will have a little bit of stretch, but once you pull harder than the limit of that stretch, what you're going to be doing is snapping some of the threads in the binding. There is a little bit in cross grain, but not a lot. If you've cut straight of grain pieces that are parallel to the selvage, there's no stretch there. And a lot of people do that because that's how they get the length to match the quilt they're putting it on, so there's no seam line. But because there's no stretch there, and when you go to pull on it, it has to give somewhere, and it can't give under all the stitching, so it's going to give in the binding itself, and you're going to snap threads. There's only so many threads on the folded edge of a piece of fabric. If we took this fabric and folded it over on this edge here, there's only so many threads that are actually running that way within the fold. And so what happens is those threads are likely to break. If this was a single fold binding and you break those edge pieces, then your binding is going to start failing rather early. If you use on the bias, rather than folded pieces this way, you have pieces that are this way unfolded. So you've got multiple threads running. So instead of a long line of a thread breaking, you have a pinprick if it breaks. But because bias is so stretchy, it has flexibility when you're pulling or tugging on that quilt. It's sort of like a tree that's blowing in the wind. If it's a really brittle tree, a really straight tree, and the wind blows, it can only go so far before it snaps. A very flexible tree would be able to bend all the way over and then snap back up without breaking. And this is why the bias is like that flexible tree. It allows the binding to stretch a little bit without breaking. The other nice thing about bias is it makes it easy to go around the corners. If you were doing scallops or curves, it also makes it very easy for those, because it's so flexible and stretchy, to go around those curves in a beautiful way. So that's why I use the, I've always called it a French fold double bias binding is the long name for it. It has the two folds, so if one happens to fail, you still have the other fold in there. And I think if you ever had the chance to talk to a quilt historian or somebody who restores quilts, they would tell you that a bias binding is always going to last longer than a straight of grain binding or a cross grain binding. I think you would find that in every case. So this is why I go to the trouble to do that type of binding. In the future, I'm going to try and show 2 other types of finishes for the edge. One of them would be really for kids or a beginner, and then the other one is more geared towards art quilting. But I want to thank you for stopping into the studio today and spending some time with us, and we look forward to seeing you next time.